Hi, my name's Samuel Leeds, and in this video I want to talk about some of the bad sides, the dangers to property investing. I now have personally been investing in property for over a decade. I'm also the best-selling author of these property books, Buy Low, Rent High, and also How to Get Financially Free in 7 Days. So if you haven't read these already, get them from Amazon and you can read these. So what are the big dangers and risks? Well, I think every worst nightmare for a property investor or a landlord is that their property will get trashed. Also, what happens if there's a bad tenant? You know, if there's someone in the property that's not paying rent, or there's somebody that's just generally being an awful tenant that can't go. How do you stop that happening? But even more so, what do you do if it does? Let me first talk about bad tenants. The only thing that's worse than no tenant is a bad tenant. How can a tenant be bad? Well, really, the only two things that I think they can do to be a bad tenant, generally speaking, is they can not look after the property and trash the property, or they can just stop paying any rent. So what do you do when that happens? Ideally, it won't happen. I've got dozens and dozens and dozens of tenants, and it's very, very rare that that happens. And the reason is because before I ever move a tenant into one of my properties, I always make sure that the letting agent vets the tenant. So what do you have to look for when moving a tenant in? Well, firstly, never move a tenant in out of desperation. So sometimes I see investors where they exaggerate the rent. So they think that the rent is going to be, say, £500, and usually that's because they've been lied to when they bought the property from a sourcer or an agent. So they put the property at an overinflated price, and then the property sits empty for months. And then what happens is the investor, the landlord, becomes desperate. And there's nothing worse than being desperate, because when you're a desperate investor or you have a property that's empty and you become desperate, you can move bad tenants in. So if you've got an empty property, I would say always hold out for a good tenant, never move somebody in a rush. So the things you have to do to vet them is, number one, are they working? Now, I'm not discriminating against people that don't work. It might be that your niche is students or DSS tenants, but personally, my properties are pretty much all professional properties. So I'm looking for, can they afford to pay the rent? If they can't, have they got a guarantor who can afford to pay the rent? So can they afford it? Number two, I want to see a previous landlord check. I want to see a reference. Now, something that I do personally is, rather than getting a landlord reference from their previous landlord, I don't do that. I get a previous landlord check. And the reason is because it might be that their previous landlord, i.e. their existing landlord, who will be previous when they move, hates their guts and is desperate to get rid of them because they're a terrible tenant. And what happens is sometimes a landlord will give a good reference just because he wants them to move on because he can't wait to get rid of them. So a more accurate reference will come from a previous to the previous. So go back maybe a few years and ask the tenant to get a previous landlord check. Also, credit check. Have they ever not paid for things before? Have they got a good credit? Get a work reference. So when they say, I'm working for this company, ask for a reference. Do they work here and are they a good member of staff? So when you've got these kind of references, credit checks, potential guarantors, it's gonna massively take the risk out of the tenant not paying any rent. So if you do these things, it should ensure that your tenant pays the rent. So you're pretty safe. Now, how do you make sure though that the tenant doesn't trash the property? Well, of course, you've got a landlord reference. Sometimes my letting agents even visit the properties that they're currently in. So if someone applies to live in one of my properties, they'll go and visit them at their existing property just to see what the condition's like. If you can do that, it's absolutely amazing, because how the condition of that property is, it's gonna be the same as your property because they'll treat it the same. Another thing is to take deposits, so that if they do, when they move out, they've damaged the carpets or their kids have drawn on the walls, you can then get that fixed with their deposit. If you're gonna take a deposit, always make sure that you do register it, and you can do that at mydeposits.co.uk. Now, something to bear in mind is when a tenant trashes the property, I have never ever in my 10-11 years of being a landlord had a tenant who's a good tenant, look after the property, everything's fine, and then one day they just trash it. I've never had that. What happens is the tenant moves in and they just don't look after it. And the kids draw on the walls and the dogs wee on the carpets or whatever. And over the months and years, the property just generally just falls into a worse and worse state of repair until they hand their notice in and move out. And then when they move out, you go and visit the property and you're like, oh my goodness, this is trashed. It's nothing like it was. And then you need to spend £10,000 redoing up the property, which wipes out the rent of the whole of that 3-year period of when the tenant was there. So how do you avoid that happening? Well, it's very, very simple. When you move a tenant in, just make sure that not only have you vetted them properly, but also that you have regular inspections. And most letting agents will do this. To begin with, you could even inspect the property after a 2 or 3 month period, then 3 months, then 6 months, and then you could just do it every 6 months, because that way, when the agent goes to the property, they'll have an inventory, which means that they'll know exactly what the state of repair was like when the tenant moved in. If it begins to get a little bit bad, if there's a bit of drawing on the wall, or there's a little bit of a dog smell when you said you didn't want dogs, you can then address it there and then before it gets too late. And I think if you do these things, if you do regular inspections, you vet the tenants well, you take the security deposits, you're very, very safe to make sure that nothing goes wrong. However, while you'll massively eliminate the risk of having bad tenants or a trashed property, there of course is still a very small chance that something could go wrong, that the tenant could stop paying or the tenant could damage the property. So what do you do if the damage is over the security deposit? What do you do if the tenant still, despite all the checks, just stops paying you the rent? Well, it's very, very clear what you should do. When a tenant moves in, you will have an AST, an assured short hold tenancy agreement in place, which will address what happens if the tenant just breaches their agreement. And if the tenant stops paying rent, usually you'll have to give them a 2-month notice period, and you'll say, look, you've got 2 months to either pay or get out of the property. Now, if after 2 months they still don't pay, then what happens? Well, I've had to do this, probably I could count on one hand how many times this has happened, but you will then have to take them to a small claims court, put in a claim against them, and it might take 3, 4, 5 months, but ultimately the law will force them to pay their rent and to leave the property. Now, worst case for you is that you might lose a few months rent, and when they leave they might end up saying, well, I can't pay, in which case they'll have a county court judgment against them, so they'll never be able to even take out a phone contract again, certainly for 5 years. You've lost a little bit of rent, but ultimately the law is there in place. The reason we have contracts and the reason we have court systems is to protect the tenants, and it's also to protect you against people that just won't pay. So the law is there in place for that. If they trash the property just out the blue one day and the property's absolutely messed up, what do? Well, you'll evict them and you'll take their deposit, but again, worst case, it is possible that you will end up having to pay out of your own pocket for the damages. You can take them to court, but are they going to be able to afford to pay it? So I think I'd just use your common sense. If the damages are £2,000 and they paid a £1,000 security deposit, what are you going to do with that £1,000 difference? Personally, by the effort, time and money to take them to court, I wouldn't do it. So that is just a little bit of a risk, which is why I always say you should have a 10% buffer, which you save up towards repairs on the property, so that when the tenant moves out, if there's wear and tear, you can invest it that way. So is property investing risky? Not really, if you do it properly. It's certainly a lot less risky than putting your money in the bank, where your money is just gonna shrink and you're not gonna get any return at all from it. Investing in property comes with big rewards, but there also is a little bit of risk. The key is to eliminate that risk by doing it properly. So I hope that video has been helpful. Please do comment your thoughts below, smash that like button, and don't forget to subscribe so that you'll never miss an upload again. Thank you so much for watching this video. It's mentoring on a Monday. Every single week at 7 p.m. on a Monday between 8 p.m. I'm going to be live answering all your comments and questions. Don't forget to subscribe right over here so you'll never miss one of these videos. I'll see you next week at 7 p.m. Also, if you haven't got a copy of my book, you need this in your life. You can get it from Amazon for £10.99 or a gift from me absolutely free down below in the description link. I'll see you next week, Monday at 7 p.m.